So why are chronic sinusitis and rhinitis considered gateway claims for many toxic exposure veterans?
Those are typically the type of conditions and their symptomology that show up first when you've been exposed to particulate matter and things like that. They're typically going to show up before the more serious COPD and things like that. So I can say that's why it's considered a gateway, is because it's some of the first manifestations. And also because there's other conditions that you can then get secondary service connected, like sleep apnea, migraines, things like that. So while I don't know that they're considered gateway conditions, I would say that if they were, that might be the reason why.
What specific symptoms does a veteran have to document to achieve those different ratings of 30% or 50%?
If we're talking about rhinitis, that's different to sinusitis. They are different diseases, different conditions with different clinical symptoms. When you're dealing with rhinitis, that's going to be things that are here in your nose, and it's typically going to be rated under your total blockage or obstruction, as they call it. And so the more obstructed your nasal passages are, the higher that rating is going to be. And if you have total obstruction in both sides of your nasal passages, that's when you're going to be looking at the higher rating of 30%, which is the highest rating you can get for rhinitis. Sinusitis is a 50% rating at the highest, meaning you can't get more than that. And that rating is reserved for people that are having surgeries in order to fix their sinuses here, even after surgery, still having a lot of symptoms like discharge, headaches, things like that. Or if they've had multiple surgeries and they're still really not becoming symptom-free. So it is a pretty serious condition or a big disability picture when you're dealing with the 50% for the sinusitis.
What is total obstruction of the nasal passage?
It's when both sides are blocked. So when we talk about total obstruction, a 10% rating means that it's completely closed off, you're having a lot of difficulties, but there's no nasal polyps. The 30% rating, which is the highest, is total obstruction with nasal polyps. So that's going to be the difference between 10 and 30. Again, 30 being the highest.
Is it possible for a veteran to be rated for both chronic sinusitis and chronic rhinitis?
Yes.
Simultaneously?
Yeah, as long as the conditions are giving different symptoms, then yes, you can be. So as long as the symptoms don't overlap, you can have ratings for both at the same time.
And what is a common secondary condition to chronic sinusitis and rhinitis?
So when you're dealing with these, we see a lot of times headaches. So if your sinusitis or your rhinitis is causing headaches, you can get service connected for those. Things like asthma, difficulty breathing, as well as sleep apnea can be secondary.
What medical evidence is required to confirm a diagnosis of chronic sinusitis for the VA?
It does need to be actually documented in there. You can't just say, oh, I have sinusitis. So it's usually an x-ray of the sinus cavities. An ENT can have clinical notes in there, as well as nasal endoscopies. So in addition to the x-ray, if they need to take a deeper look, obviously a CT is also very helpful.
Does the need for continuous medical treatment, like nasal surgery or frequent steroid use, does that influence the VA's severity rating, or is it just dependent upon the blockage of the passage?
So yes, it is more than just the blockage with nasal polyps or not. C&P examiners are required to discuss things like the frequency, duration, and the medications that are used to control these conditions. When you're looking at a lot of frequent steroid use, things like that, that's more indicative of a 30% rating for either of those conditions. And obviously, if you've had some kind of surgery, that's also indicative of a higher rating as well. So yes, those continued treatments for those conditions can be indicative of the higher ratings.
Are these presumptive conditions under the PACT Act?
They are. So if you served in Southwest Asia, burn pits exposure, things like that, both sinusitis and rhinitis, as well as asthma, are presumptive under the PACT Act.
So say you had previously applied for sinusitis and rhinitis and got denied before the PACT Act. What's the process for being able to get approved now because it is a presumptive under the PACT Act?
So if you need to reopen a claim, you're going to file a supplemental claim via 200995, and you're going to want to reopen that, and your new and relevant evidence would be the PACT Act, and then they would process that through the PACT Act. So you can just fill out the form, and then on the actual form, write it on there. You could also just write a statement saying, hey, this is due to the PACT Act. On the supplemental claim form, there's also an area that says, what is your new and relevant evidence? You could just check that box and write the PACT Act. But for the most part, if you have served in these areas and it's a presumptive condition, they're going to process it under the PACT Act.